Hi everyone, I'm Hussein, and in this video we're going to talk about constructors, deconstructors, and destructors of a class. The constructor is a special method of a class. To define a constructor, for example, in a student class, we shall write its visibility, let's say public, and then student, the name of the class, then parentheses, and finally the curly braces. Now, what should we do inside a constructor? We initialize the data of a class. For example, in this student class, let's change this to private string first name. Now, come down to here, change it to. These were properties as we learned in our last video, so I'm changing them to data private. Now we can assume that we are going to initialize the first name and last name. In the student class example, we write string first name and then string last name. And in here, we write this dot first name and then this dot last name. If you don't know about this, make sure to check out our previous video. Now, to use this class, we write student1 new to allocate memory on RAM, then student. Now, if we just write student, we see an error. The reason is because we should write the first name and last name. So I write the Joe Black. You see, it's now working. Now you might ask Hussein why creating a new object of the student had no problem without specifying any argument. That's because of the implicit constructor that every class has, which means once you didn't define any kind of constructor, the compiler will create a default constructor which has no parameter. This is the default constructor. So once we're defining one constructor, no matter what, this constructor will not be created automatically by the compiler. So once we're writing here, student1 new student, we can easily do it because we defined this constructor. But if we remove this, it cannot happen because we forced it to use this constructor, and that default constructor no longer exists. And the reason that compiler creates a default constructor is because every class must have a constructor. So when you don't define any constructor, the compiler will do the job. Another thing for constructor that I'm going to mention here is that you can set the visibility to private. Let me simplify this for you. Now, you can set it as a private, and then let me remove this part. Remove. Now, you can see that now you cannot create a new student object by just writing new student because you can't see the constructor here. And now you might say, so what's the point? Why should we set the visibility to private? Because this way you can create your objects in another way. You can come here and say public static. Do you remember that? If you don't remember, check out our previous video. The student and then create student. Then we can return new student. Now it should do the job. That create a student. Now you might ask, well, that's interesting as an alternative way of creating a new object of a student, but why should we do it? We could simply just write new student. That's right, but in here you have some advantages. For example, you can come here and define a data and write private static student. Now me. Here we can say if me was null, then create a new object and put it to the me, and then just return me. You see now, this way we can create the student object only one time. And this thing that we just did here is actually a design pattern called single font. We can create a single font super easy this way. Now, if I just write student2 and then create a student this way, both student2 and student1 are actually one object, but have two pointers to that object, and that object is this object in here that we defined it. Okay, now let's talk about Destructor. As we know, every object has a life cycle. It will start once you write the new, and it will work until your work is done with that object and you no longer need it. Then the garbage collector of CLR will come in and then collects your wasted object and destroys, and then will free the memory allocation of that object. So when we are talking about Destructor, we are talking about that part of a object's life cycle that your object is going to be destroyed by the garbage collector. To define a destructor, we can come to here in student example. We will write a tilde, then student, and curly braces. That's it. The only point about the destructors is you don't know when they will be called. There's nothing you can do about it. It's not over your control, but you can know when the object is going to be destroyed. Now the other thing that I'm going to talk about is DeConstructors. To define a deconstructor, you should go to the class and then write public void deconstruct. Then you should write all of your data fields here, and starting with out, a string first name, then again out, the other data, last name. Now using curly braces here, first name, this dot first name, again last name, and this dot last name. How to use it? Here we come, a string first name and string last name, and using an assignment point, writing student1, and that's it. Now let's talk about another useful keyword that is used within the classes. So now let's assume that we have a constructor called student, and then another constructor called the student, which receives the student class as an argument. Then we have a private student data, and now let's initialize this by writing student. Now assume that you're going to receive this argument and you want to just set it once, and that one time is only inside the constructor. For that, there's a keyword that you can specify it as a read only, which means it is set one time in one of the constructors, no matter where. I can also define it here if I have this student, but the point is that you will assign this student one time inside one of the constructors, and then you will use it everywhere inside the class, no matter where. For example, here I can say public string get full name. Now return as student dot last name, because I'm inside that thing. Now in here, if I write a student, new student, it is not possible. As you see, there's a compiler error which doesn't let me to do this anywhere inside my class, because I defined this student as a read-only object. Thank you for watching this video. I hope you enjoyed this. Leave a like if you like this video and make sure to subscribe and hit the bell so you will be notified once I publish my next video. Thank you.